Okay, and now for our main program. To introduce our main program is Jan Levy. Many of you know Jan. She served as Executive Director for Leadership Tomorrow until retiring last year. Did you know that she was a 1987 Leadership Tomorrow graduate? So this Seattle native and proud graduate of Garfield High School has used her leadership expertise to guide many organizations, including 2 national boards, the Community Leadership Association and the Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership. Fun fact, before she was a buttoned-up servant leader and all that stuff, she was a professional dancer in New York City. But there's more. Following that, she worked for a rock band. You might have heard of them, Blood, Sweat, and Tears. And she also went to Woodstock, so I'm sure she has a lot of fun stories. So please help me welcome Jan Levy to the stage.
I can't tell you any of the stories. I'd get in trouble. So I first met Noah Purcell in 2012 when he became a member of the Leadership Tomorrow class of 2013. Go LT. I found him to be thoughtful and smart. Little did I know how smart he was. Just like me, Noah is a Seattle native. I hate to say it, but he attended Franklin, which was Garfield's biggest rival. But it was at Franklin where he fell in love with the law, and he was part of the school's mock trial team. His mock trial coach, a man named Rick Nagel, said his strengths were extraordinary, noting that his preparation, and this is a direct quote, left no stone unturned. Noah met his wife, Jasmine, who's down here, when he was at Franklin, and they both attended the UW. While he was an undergrad, he and Jasmine filed a lawsuit against the University of Washington to block an unjust fee being charged to students. They argued that the U didn't have the right to charge that particular fee, and they won, forced the university to rescind the fee and refund millions of dollars to students. He started early. Then it was off to University College in Dublin, where he received a master's in economics before attending Harvard Law, where he was editor of the Law Review and graduated magna cum laude in 2007. I told you he was smart. When I met Noah, he was an attorney for Perkins Coie, where he handled Voting Rights Act cases, cases on behalf of patients seeking access to health care, and pro bono matters on behalf of juvenile immigrants. Before joining Perkins, Noah served in the Department of Homeland Security, Office of the General Counsel during the Obama administration, where he worked on a range of immigration and security issues. And before that, he was a law clerk for Supreme Court Justice David Souter. Soon after Noah graduated from Leadership Tomorrow, actually it was before he graduated, we were not surprised to learn that he had been appointed by Bob Ferguson as the state's Solicitor General. Bob called Noah among the best and brightest lawyers in our state. And once Noah entered the national spotlight, Ferguson tweeted, "Making Noah Solicitor General was one of my best decisions." Noah and Jasmine live on Beacon Hill, just a few houses down from where Noah grew up. They have 3 children, and coming full circle, Noah volunteers for Franklin High School's mock trial team. He also coaches youth soccer and supports the food bank at St. Mary's in the Central District. Clearly, Noah believes in giving back. So, please join me in welcoming Noah Purcell, State Solicitor General.
Well, thank you, Jan, for that incredibly kind introduction, and thank you all for having me here today. It's really an honor to be here with you. When Jan first asked me to come and speak about the travel ban case, and about my role in the office, I was a little concerned because I know that you all have heard from Attorney General Ferguson and Judge Robart about their roles in the travel ban case, and I sort of wondered, what else could I possibly say? And you may be wondering that as well, and we'll find out today if I have anything to add. Rob Labasco made a very helpful suggestion about how I could focus my comments that made sense to me, and hopefully it will make sense to you as well. So he thought that I should talk about a little bit more about my background and sort of some lessons I had learned in life that I brought to the case, and also just the role of the Solicitor General's office more generally. So that's what I'm going to do. Hopefully it will make sense. Please direct any complaints to Rob. So like Jan said, let's see here. Where do I need to point this? Oh, there we go. Okay. So, whoops. I grew up on Beacon Hill. This is my 5th grade class. I'm over there. Well, I won't tell you who I am. And some of you are probably wondering, wow, he's starting in 5th grade. How long is this presentation going to be? Don't worry, it's only 4 hours long. I timed it earlier, and about 20 minutes. So, but I put this up. I grew up on Beacon Hill and attended Kimball, and I don't know if there's any Kimball Cougars in the audience. Anybody? No. Okay. Well, Kimball was an incredible school, incredibly diverse, a lot of students from very low-income backgrounds, and a lot of students who faced a lot of challenges that I honestly didn't face. And that was something that my parents emphasized to me from very early in life, that they both worked in nonprofits. We weren't rich exactly, but we had a lot of advantages. I had a roof over my head. I always had enough food. I had 2 loving parents who had both gone to college. And, that was a lot more than a lot of my classmates had. And I saw that again at Franklin. So this is a picture of the Franklin mock trial team that Jan mentioned from 1997. My wife Jasmine is over there. I'm in the middle there with the long hair. It was not the best look for me. Jasmine has many wonderful qualities, but keeping her eyes open in pictures is not one of them. It's still a problem. But that team, it was a remarkable group of students. It was really an incredible group, and we had a great coach, Rick Nagel, and a bunch of brilliant, hardworking students. And we won the state championship that year and went to the national championship. But on that team, there was a young woman who was often sleeping in her car with her family. There were a number of immigrant students, some of them undocumented, and many of the students on that team didn't even go on to college, much less law school. And all of them could have been very, very successful lawyers. Not that everyone should be a lawyer, but you get the point. And so my point is, I guess, that I learned very early in life that people don't always get the opportunities that they deserve. And, way too much depends on what family you're born into, what country you're born in, and sort of what opportunities you're given. And my parents drummed into me from an early age that because of the opportunities that I'd been given, I had an obligation to do something with those to help other people. Much like, I'm learning now this organization's approach. So growing up in Seattle and going to Franklin, we learned a lot about some of the saddest chapters in our country's history. We read a lot about the Japanese internment, we read novels, we read a lot of historical materials. And then when I went to the Attorney General's office, I learned more about our state's role in that terrible chapter in our country's history, and in particular, at the time the executive order EO 9066 was issued, the Attorney General of Washington at the time went and testified in Congress in support of it. And when the Korematsu case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court challenging the constitutionality of that order, Washington and Oregon and California jointly filed an amicus brief in the Supreme Court arguing that it was constitutional and should be upheld. Earl Warren, by the way, was the Attorney General of California at the time. So just a sort of remarkably sad stance that our state and the rest of the West Coast took. And so I guess part of my point, another lesson that I learned relatively early on in life was to learn from the mistakes of the past and try not to repeat them. So after Franklin, as Jan said, went on to college at UW, and sorry about the wedding picture, this is a little weird, but that's the only picture I had of me and Jasmine at UW that I could find. We got married right after college. And as Jan said, we were really involved in student government at UW. We did a bunch of activism. And one of the things we were really involved in was trying to keep tuition affordable. And towards the tail end of our first senior year, I won't talk about the second senior year, but toward the tail end of our first senior year, the university imposed this new energy fee, they called it. And the university, at that time, the legislature was supposed to control tuition, and the university was allowed to add additional course fees for specific courses that were particularly expensive. But we thought that this energy surcharge that everyone had to pay for every class was clearly illegal. And we kept saying that over and over again in meetings at the Board of Regents and with the administration, and no one was listening to us. And we kept waiting for someone to step in and say, you can't do this. And no one ever did. And so they passed it, and it took effect. And eventually, we decided to hire a lawyer and file this lawsuit, which seems, in retrospect, completely insane. I mean, suing your university is not generally something I recommend to young people, but we won, and the university the university had to refund $1.5 million to students. And so a major lesson I learned from that experience actually was that it really doesn't matter what laws are on the books if there's no one willing and able to enforce them. Illegal stuff happens all the time if there's no one there to challenge it. And then, as Jan said, I went on to law school at Harvard, which was a bit of a culture shock. That's me with my family at graduation. I was the only student wearing shorts the first day of class in my section. Anyway, West Coast mistake. And then I had the wonderful privilege of clerking for Justice Souter, and that's a picture of me and my co-clerks and his other staff in the Oval Office after he announced his retirement. And I learned a lot. During my time out there, but one of the most interesting, and maybe, in some ways it's the simplest lesson, but one of the most profound that stuck with me. Growing up out here in Seattle, I sort of always felt like we were in this corner of the country, and somewhere out there, maybe in New York or DC or somewhere, was this group of super smart people who really knew what was going on, who knew how to run the world, and who knew how to solve the world's problems. And I was wrong. And I first realized I was wrong when I got to Harvard. And there were a lot of smart, very hardworking students there, well, great students. But the biggest difference between my fellow students there and at UW was not brains or how hard they worked. It was really sort of the access to opportunities and connections. And almost all of my classmates went on to really interesting, either really interesting jobs in government or really high-paying jobs in private law firms or the private sector or other interesting things. And it wasn't because they were uniformly amazing. It was in large part because there were so many opportunities to connect with those people and references and people who knew people who could help you get those jobs. And then clerking, I saw that even with Supreme Court justices, right? They're just people. Some of them are nice, some are not so nice, some are brilliant, some are not so brilliant, some are funny, some are not so funny. And so probably one of the most profound lessons I learned during our time on the East Coast was that just there really was no super special group of people out there who was going to solve our world's problems. We're just as able to solve them here in Seattle as anyone else can. So after our time on the East Coast, we moved back to Seattle, and I worked at Perkins Coie, as Jan said, for several years, and then Attorney General Ferguson hired me to be the Solicitor General, and that was sort of a dream come true. I mean, I still to this day can't really believe that he did that. It was a bold choice. I had never had a one-on-one conversation with him before he asked me to interview for the job, and he took a huge chance hiring me. And it is my dream job. I mean, here's sort of a description of the main things we do in the office. We oversee all the appeals that the state has in state and federal court. We do a ton of amicus briefs. We write attorney general opinions for elected officials who ask difficult legal questions. We write the words that go on the ballot to describe the effect of initiatives or referenda that you're voting on. I apologize that they're often so difficult to understand. We only get 33 words to do it, and usually, they do a lot of things. And then we advise the governor, the secretary of state, and the legislature, though they don't always listen to us. So that's the normal job, and it's a wonderful job. And the job got even more interesting last January. So it's been particularly interesting since last January. So, here's the speech that started a lot of what came next.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on.
Okay, so that's what the president said during the campaign, and that, I think it's fair to say, became exhibit A, B, C, D, and E of our lawsuit challenging the travel ban, that it was, in fact, motivated by discrimination. A week after he took office, he signed the travel ban executive order late on a Friday evening, and that was, January 27th of last year. So the next day, well, just a quick reminder of what it did. I won't go over it in detail, but it's worth remembering. It banned people from 7 countries from coming into the United States, even if they had been living in the United States for many years legally. So for example, if you were originally from Iran, but you'd been living in the United States for 25 years with a green card, maybe you had US citizen children, if you happened to be in Vancouver, BC when the travel ban was signed, you could not come back into the country. There were professors, so you can imagine the effects on Washington were immediate and catastrophic. There were professors and students at our state universities who were stranded overseas. There were families that were separated and torn apart. And there were employees at some of our biggest companies who were supposed to travel for work or who were just planning to visit their families overseas and who all of a sudden could not. So we started to see the effects right away and hear about them. And thankfully, a lot of people came out and protested very quickly. This is a picture from SeaTac Airport on Saturday, the day after the ban was signed. There were similar protests all over the country at airports and other places. And while those protests were happening, I was at the office, and the Attorney General had been out of the state on Friday and then came back on Saturday, and we had a long discussion about whether we could bring a lawsuit challenging the travel ban. And the things I was thinking about were essentially the lessons that I was talking about earlier. We could have just left it to advocacy groups like the ACLU or individual people who were affected to bring lawsuits, but I felt like that wasn't fair. They should not, the people being targeted should not be the ones who had to challenge this illegal action. We as a state had an opportunity to stand up and say, this is not who we are, this is illegal, and we had the opportunity to do that, we had an obligation to do it. That law is meaningless without enforcement. I thought it was clearly illegal. I'm sure there were people, well, if the president asked anyone, I don't know that he asked any lawyers. If he had, I'm sure they would have probably told him, there's a lot of legal risks here. It's probably illegal, but it's meaningless without enforcement. I was reminded of not repeating the mistakes of the past, learning from our country's prior failures. And then the last thing was, maybe the biggest thing, we were talking about filing a lawsuit very quickly against the federal government about this massive policy, and none of us in our office had ever done anything remotely like that before. I mean, the idea that starting on Saturday, we would file a lawsuit on Monday against the federal government about, this controversial new policy that really was unprecedented, it was terrifying in many ways. But, the more I thought about it, the more I thought, we're just as well placed to do this as anyone. We can do it, and, let's try. And we did. So we worked all weekend. We called in a team of people from across our office, called a lot of people outside our office, too, to ask for advice and help. And we filed our lawsuit on Monday. This is a quote from a news story about, when you file a motion for a temporary restraining order, you have to file it in person at the courthouse. And we didn't finish writing and editing everything until about 4:45 on Monday. We had to get to the courthouse by 5. So a bunch of us hopped in a car and started heading over there. Seattle, 4:45 on a Monday, we weren't really moving. So then we all hopped out of the car and started running. The quote is mostly accurate, except that I did not lead the race because it turns out there are several people in our office much faster than me. This is Judge Robart, who I know you heard from not that long ago. And he had some very insightful things to say about the case. It was a whirlwind. We filed a lawsuit on Monday. The hearing in front of him was on Friday. In the meantime, we had to file several additional briefs. There was very little sleep. The federal government's response was due Thursday at midnight, and the hearing was Friday at 2 o'clock. So the first time we saw their arguments was basically 14 hours before the hearing, and some of those are hours that I at least am normally sleeping. And so we had a conference call at 1 in the morning and divided up the different arguments the other side was making to sort of, you go research this, you go research that, everybody write up what you think the best responses are for each point. And then I woke up around 4 in the morning to emails from all these people on our team, here's my suggestions about this and that, started practicing. We had a moot court around 11, and then walked over to the courthouse. And I don't know if anyone was there, but it was a circus. There were hundreds and hundreds of people trying to get into the courtroom. They ended up having 2 overflow courtrooms which I understand were actually quite fun because people were cheering and booing and stuff, which did not happen in the regular courtroom. The regular courtroom was basically just the lawyers on the case, a bunch of reporters, other federal judges from the courthouse who wanted to watch, and then my mom, who was the first person in line to get in and actually sat through, I think Judge Robart mentioned he had some sort of civil contract dispute trial that morning, and my mom sat through part of that so that she could watch this. Anyway, Judge Robart asked very pointed questions of both sides, and really I did not know which way he was going to rule. I really didn't know that if we were going to win or not as the hearing went on, and even as he started to read his ruling from the bench, I didn't know if we were going to win. And then he said this.
This TRO is granted on a nationwide basis and prohibits enforcement of sections 3C, 5A, 5B, 5C, and 5E of the executive order.
Yes, so that was a pretty incredible moment. We hadn't really had any time to think about what would happen if we won, and I think it's fair to say that we were all pretty overcome at that moment, because just thinking about the enormity of what had just happened, that this was going to stop the order nationwide. And we started to see the impacts very quickly. People had their visas reinstated, people were able to travel, families were able to reunite, people were able to come here for medical treatment, and it was just an incredible feeling. Well, thank you. But it wasn't over yet, actually. Later that night, Friday night, the government told us they were going to appeal. The Trump administration told us they were going to appeal. And then Saturday night, around 9 o'clock, they filed their appeal brief. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the federal court for the West Coast, told us that our response was due the next day, Super Bowl Sunday at midnight. So we had basically 27 hours to write the most important brief that any of us had ever worked on. And so again, basically no sleep for anyone on our team. And again, we had a conference call late at night, divided up different sections, people went off and wrote. And then I put everything together on Sunday, and we got it filed. And then, and the argument was going to be on Tuesday. That night, I don't know if folks remember, it also snowed a fair amount by Seattle standards, like 3 inches, and so the city sort of shut down, and my kids wanted to go to the park sledding. So there's the two older ones, our two older ones. We went to the park, which was very relaxing, actually, good to get away for a little bit. The government's main argument, I didn't mention on that last slide, the government's main argument was not that the travel ban was the best thing since sliced bread. It was really that we couldn't challenge it, that we didn't have standing to challenge it, and that really no one could challenge it. That argument did not go over well at the Ninth Circuit. So there's a question from one of the judges on the Ninth Circuit panel. Are you saying that the president's discretion in issuing this executive order is unreviewable? And the other side's lawyer, who I don't blame for this because he was put in an impossible position, but there's a long pause, and then he says, "Yes, that's what we're saying." And the judges did not like that at all. Judges are used to being able to review things, even very sensitive things, as we pointed out over and over. There were cases about enemy combatants being held at Guantanamo Bay that were reviewed in the courts. If you can review that, you should sure be able to review a case that's affecting, an Iranian American who lives in Bellevue and has lived there for 20 years who can't come back into the country. So we won completely on Thursday, and then, so Tuesday's the argument, Thursday's the hearing, the ruling, and by the way, the argument, I had no idea how many people were going to watch the argument. I figured a lot of students, like law students, would watch, some lawyers, but I couldn't imagine that it would be carried on TV or anything because it was all by phone, so there was no video. And so when I later found out that CNN and others had carried it live, I was surprised. So then they ruled in our favor completely, and then came the humor highlight of the case when the president said this, "See you in court," after we just won, and we thought, where do you think we've been for the last 2 weeks? But anyway, yeah. But he seemed to be saying, we'll see you at the Supreme Court. And honestly, I was really looking forward to that. I was confident that we would have won if the case had gone to the U.S. Supreme Court. I was, sort of excited about the idea of that would have been my first argument ever at the Supreme Court. It would have been quite something if that had been it. I was looking forward to it. But cooler heads, probably in the U.S. Solicitor General's office, prevailed, and I think they must have convinced, either they didn't tell him that they could appeal to the Supreme Court, or they convinced him that they were going to lose. I don't know, because I'm confident we would have won. They did not appeal. They withdrew the first executive order, travel ban. They paid our costs for the case, and instead they issued the second and then the third version of the travel ban, which we challenged and others challenged. And those were significantly narrow, but it's those ones that went up to the Supreme Court in the case brought by Hawaii. So that's sort of the story of the case. I just want sort of a few last notes, and then I'll take any questions people have. I got a ridiculous amount of attention after the case. I mean, people were stopping me on the street, at the grocery store, high-fiving me. And I tried to always emphasize to people, there were a lot of people who worked on this case. I did the argument, but no one. So there's a lot of people who deserve a lot of credit in our office who worked very hard on it. And then the other thing I'd say is that the recognition that sort of meant the most to me really was from the places I had the most profound connections to. And so I got an award from my old high school, Franklin. Apologies to the Garfield grads in the audience, but Garfield's also a great school. It is. There's a lot of immigrant students at Franklin. There's a lot of refugee students at Franklin. There's a lot of Muslim students at Franklin. And to hear from them firsthand about what the case meant to them was, more valuable than any award or any other recognition that we got in the course of the case. And then one last thing. So Kimball, my elementary school, our son now goes there. That's him in the front row with his hands in his pockets. We need to work on his posture for pictures. But I got a letter from a woman who was one of my teachers there, and I just want to read it to you. So she said, "Dear Noah," and this came right after we won the case. "Dear Noah, just wanted to thank you and express my appreciation for your accomplishment. You probably don't remember me, but I was an English language learner teacher at Kimball when you attended. I'm writing to you from the perspective of someone whose family was greatly affected by another executive order, EO 9066. 75 years ago, my family was uprooted and sent to the horse stalls in Puyallup Fairgrounds, then to Minidoka, Idaho, where I was born in this internment camp. You can see why I'm greatly concerned with what is happening in our country now and why I felt such pride when I saw you in the news. Please keep up the fight. And please give my regards to your mother." So that was, without a doubt, the single most powerful letter I got in the course of the case, and it's really stuck with me. And it was actually one of the only things I had on my desk. It came in actually between the district court ruling and the Ninth Circuit argument, and I had it on my desk during the argument. So in closing, I just want to say that although these are very challenging times, I feel hopeful and I feel lucky. I feel lucky that when the travel ban was issued, I was in a position to be able to do something about it. I had an opportunity to do something about it. I feel lucky that I had a boss in Attorney General Ferguson who was brave enough to decide that we would bring this case. And I feel lucky that I live in a community and in a state that was incredibly supportive of that effort. So thank you all. I'm happy to answer any questions folks have, and I really appreciate your time and attention today. Thank you very much. Thank you.
First question over here.
Yes.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Faith Ireland.
Yes,
and,
hi, Justice Ireland.
I always appreciated the Solicitor Generals because they came to argue before the State Supreme Court when I
Yes.
was there. And I just wanted to ask you if you could enlighten us on what the Supreme Court ultimately did as far as this travel ban. So what's the status now?
Sure. Well, very disappointingly, they upheld the third version of the ban and essentially said that, by the third version, they had gone through this whole process. The federal government had gone through this whole process, and their whole argument was, this is completely different from that first thing. Don't pay any attention to that. This, the State Department and Department of Homeland Security and all these entities did an international review of security protocols in different countries, and this is a well thought through policy. And the Supreme Court essentially deferred to the administration on that and sort of took their word for it. And it was disappointing to me. I sort of understand why they did it, because they don't want, it's difficult, the Supreme Court doesn't want to come out and say, this president is just different from, from other administrations, even though I think that's the reality. I mean, the reality is, I've had an opportunity over the last year and a half to talk to a number of folks who worked in White House counsel's office in past administrations, and hearing them talk about the process they went through before issuing an executive order, and the kind of review that would happen, and the lawyers that would be consulted, and then what happened here, where basically Steve Miller and Steve Bannon got in a room and wrote the executive order, and then they sort of had to, and then afterwards they had to come up with a second version and a third version that would be defensible. I mean, it's completely different, but the Supreme Court, I think, feels like they need to protect sort of the institution of the presidency, and so there has to be some sort of deference to the role of the president's office, which I understand. I just really don't think it was appropriate in this particular case, and I think they could have found a way to be more honest about what really happened here. And so the bottom line, though, the outcome is that the third version of the travel ban remains in effect. It applies to a slightly different list of countries than the original one. It does have some exceptions and a waiver process, but unlike the original one, which was explicitly temporary, this one is permanent. It's indefinite, basically. Until someone revokes it, it's in place. So right now, if you're from one of those countries that's on the list, you might be able to come on a student visa, potentially, or a visitor visa of some kind, depending on the country, but you cannot get a green card to come to the United States. It's impossible. If you're from Iran right now, it's impossible to become an American, which is just profoundly troubling to me. I just use Iran as an example. My mother-in-law is from Iran, and it just, yeah, it just, you know, people who want to leave these countries and come to the United States often, right, are trying to escape oppression or religious persecution or other things, and they can't. So, yes.
As a Garfield graduate, I will forgive you for attending Franklin. I assume it was not your fault. You were just couldn't get into Garfield.
This is turning out to be the most controversial part of my entire presentation, is the high school.
Definitely.
But, yeah.
I would like you to try to explain the differences between the state attorney general position and the solicitor general position. I think a lot of people, including the lawyers in the room, do not really understand how that takes place.
So until 1993, our Attorney General's office, we did not have a Solicitor General position. It was something that Chris Gregoire created in part to make sure that our office's practice in the state Supreme Court primarily, but also at the US Supreme Court, was kind of consistently excellent. Before that, each division in the office had sort of, if there was an appeal that went up, they just were responsible for preparing it and getting the lawyers ready and all that sort of thing. And Gregoire thought that there should be a more centralized approach for big cases and appeals. And that was sort of modeled on the US Solicitor General's office, which has been around for since I think the early 1800s, and it serves that same purpose. The US Solicitor General's office handles all of the appeals of the federal government at the US Supreme Court. So it didn't always exist. The main difference is, so the Attorney General can and sometimes does argue cases, not always, but can. Obviously, the Attorney General has a lot of other responsibilities as well, right? Both public responsibilities, management responsibilities, other sorts of things. And so my role is really, the Solicitor General role is really more to be, I mean, I have some management responsibilities and such, but it's mostly to be the lawyer for the office for big appeals is the idea. And so that I can, I don't do all of them myself. I have a great team. There's 7 Deputy Solicitors General who I work with who are all outstanding. But I oversee, and that's my focus, is really on the legal work in the big appeals. And I had 2 great predecessors. Justice Ireland probably saw. Narda Pierce was the first State Solicitor General, and then Maureen Hart, both served for long periods of time, were both fabulous, both great mentors to me, and I learned a lot from them. Yeah, yes?
You reflected that absent somebody challenging a particular issue, the rule of law may not be enforced. Right. And during a dinner with one of the justices, he reflected that not all of the rulings that they have are fully, they don't come to a conclusion. Some of them are ambiguous. at the time he was reflecting on eminent domain, and that it doesn't necessarily mean what everybody has interpreted it to mean. What are those instances that you have concern about that the Supreme Court has ruled on that you think we might have to argue about in the future?
Well, let's see. That's an interesting question. So I guess it's not necessarily tied to what the Supreme Court has or hasn't ruled on so much as kind of just what draws lawyers' attention. So for example, our office now, we have a civil rights unit that brings a lot of cases that probably wouldn't make sense for a private attorney to bring, because there's no way to make a living doing them. There's not a lot of damages, that sort of thing. But they bring, in my view, very important cases that just, often it's not a huge amount of money at stake for any one individual or that sort of thing. And if they weren't there, a lot of those cases would not be brought. So it's not really tied necessarily to what the Supreme Court has or hasn't decided so much as just, the way our legal system is structured. You really need, unless someone's going to take your case pro bono, you really need to have a case that has some potential for compensation for a lawyer to do it, which I don't mean in a bad way. Lawyers need to make a living. It's just that's just a reality of our system. And so a lot of things that really are pretty clearly illegal just don't ever get challenged, because no one's there to stop them. I can't think of an example offhand that's tied to kind of a past decision of the Supreme Court. I mean, I think a lot of decisions of the Supreme Court rely on, sadly, kind of false premises about the way the world works or what will happen after they rule, but that's kind of a different problem. Yes?
I noticed that you didn't mention Roosevelt for all the Roosevelt grads.
There's a lot of great high schools in Seattle. Ingram, West Seattle, Cleveland. We're going to the private schools. Yeah, I mean, it's all, yeah. Anyway, sorry.
The whole country right now is focused on the Supreme Court and what's happening in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
It appears that the ideological balance on the court is about to change, or could change as early as this Friday.
Yeah.
How does that affect your kind of strategic approach to bringing these kinds of appeals?
Yeah. That's a very interesting question. So, when we filed the travel ban case, not right away, but pretty soon after that, the president started tweeting about how all these cases were being brought in the Ninth Circuit and how people were shopping for different judges and this sort of thing. And I thought that was wildly unfair. I mean, I don't, Judge Robart, for example, appointed by George W. Bush, that doesn't necessarily tell you a ton about his ideology, but it's not like, in contrast, during the Obama administration, Texas sued the federal government something like 40 times. The Texas Attorney General used to describe his job as, I wake up in the morning, I go to the office, I sue Obama, I go home. And every one of their lawsuits they filed in a judicial district in Texas where there were two judges, both extraordinarily conservative Republican appointees, And so, to accuse us of forum shopping when we filed here where our state is and in a district where there's a wide diversity of ideological views on the bench and that sort of thing struck me as ridiculous. But the thing is, right, Texas knew that ultimately at the end of the day, when their cases went up on appeal, they were going to have a relatively favorable forum in the Supreme Court. And frankly, we don't, right? I mean, for a lot of the challenges, just a lot of these are sensitive issues where the law is, most cases that go to the Supreme Court, the law is unclear or else it wouldn't be there. And so, that's just a reality that we have to deal with. Now, I do think that we would have won that first travel ban case. I think that they would have thought was just beyond the pale, and I do think we would have won. But there's a lot of other cases that it's, how does it affect our strategy? So far we haven't lost one of these cases against the federal government yet, but we do have to be careful about what cases we bring. We have to just be very confident of our arguments before we decide to file a case. And I mean, that would be true regardless, but it's particularly true with, the likelihood of hostility at the Supreme Court to a lot of the arguments that we might want to make.
I'm in the international education field, and there's some talk now about potentially singling out a certain nationality for exclusion for international student visas, that sort of thing. Any thoughts on how what you've done in the past might apply to that kind of a executive order, for example?
Well, so a couple of points about that. Number one, that I think one of the reasons we got so much support for that first case from universities and the business community, which was incredibly helpful, was that they knew that it was going to have a devastating effect on the pipeline of talent into this country, right? That people, even if you weren't from one of the 7 countries, the idea that you could go through the trouble of applying and enrolling and starting a program, and then in the middle of the program, just all of a sudden find out that you could no longer go home and visit your family or come back to this country, right, it has a serious chilling effect on people thinking of coming here. And I think I've read that there have been downturns in applications, not just from the countries that were targeted, but from other countries to U.S. universities, which is a terrible thing for our future economy. What it would mean, I mean, I do think that, some of the same arguments we made might be possible depending on the exact circumstances. I also think that, it's always hard to know with this administration what they're actually going to follow through on and what they're not. I mean, there were so many things talked about during the campaign, and some of them they've done and some they haven't. I'd like to think that they wouldn't do something like that just because the outcry from the business community in particular, I would think would be overwhelming, but you never know. So, yeah, not the most hopeful prognosis, but I wouldn't lose too much sleep over that, especially compared to some of the other things that are more immediate cause for concern, maybe. Okay, one more question.
All right, I've got a related one,
okay.
Tangentially. Recently, there was a Supreme Court ruling that some of us have read about, the Janus ruling.
Uh-huh.
And I was wondering how you feel that might impact state hiring practices. Because some union halls do hiring at the actual hall, and and they have a long-standing practice of doing this since before I was born. How do you feel about that?
Yeah. So for those who don't know, the Janus case was about whether if you're a state employee, you can't be required to join the union that represents those state employees, but you can be required to pay what are called agency fees, which means basically the cost of the parts of the union's activities that are not ideological, things like the collective bargaining process, grievances, that sort of stuff. Janus was about whether state employees could be required to pay those agency fees, and the Supreme Court held 5-4 that they can't be, overturning a case from about 50 years ago that held that they could be. And it's part of sort of a recent trend of just overturning a lot of longstanding case law, not starting with, but maybe Citizens United being among the more prominent examples. How do I feel about that? I mean, I think it's a terrible decision. I think it's wrong on the law. What you think of the policy, I mean, separate what you think of the policy. I don't think it's the right legal decision, and I think it raises all sorts of troubling legal questions about what the state can and can't require people to pay for if they're benefiting from it. And we actually joined an amicus brief at the Supreme Court arguing that it should not be overturned, but that's how it will affect hiring practices. I don't know necessarily that it will affect hiring practices so much as it will mean that state employee unions have far fewer resources to do the non-ideological sort of day-to-day work that they do of collective bargaining and grievances and that sort of stuff. So it looks like I'm all out of time, but thank you so much for your time and attention, and I really appreciate it.